Welcome back. It's time now for the France 24 debate. Today we're turning our eye to Venezuela. This as regional powers gather in the Colombian capital this Monday, joined by the Venezuelan opposition leader, Juan Guaidó. Well, they're discussing new ways to pressure Nicolas Maduro into giving up power. Well, a weekend effort to deliver US aid resulted in deadly clashes at the Colombian and Brazilian borders. Maduro regards that aid as being a smokescreen for a US invasion. And in fact, Washington is not ruling out armed action and says that Maduro's days are numbered. Well, the US Vice President Mike Pence is at the Lima Group meeting in Colombia. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
As we continue to bring economic and diplomatic pressure to bear on the Maduro regime, we hope for a peaceful transition to democracy. But as President Trump has made clear, all options are on the table.
Okay, the US Vice President Mike Pence saying that all options are on the table. For his part, Nicolas Maduro says he will never give up. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The people of Caracas have taken to the streets to support peace, to support the union of the military and the people, to tell the imperialist Donald Trump, get your hands off Venezuela. Yankee, go home.
Yankee! The Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro speaking there. So where do we go to from here? And what can this so-called Lima Group actually achieve? Who are Maduro's allies and what are they saying? And is there really the appetite for a military conflict in Washington? Well, those are some of the questions I'll be putting to our panel today. On that panel, here with me in the studio is Luis Colasante, who is a Venezuelan financial strategist. Thank you very much indeed for coming to see us. I'm joined from Geneva by Alfred De Zayas, who's a professor of law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor. I'm joined by Julia Buxton, who is a professor at the Central European University of Budapest, who's actually in Leeds at the moment. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. And from Washington, I'm joined by Mike Gonzales, who is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you all very much indeed for coming to see us. Let me start by speaking to you, Luis. There is this meeting taking place in Bogota today, the so-called Lima Group. The United States seems to be all of a sudden very focused on Venezuela. The problems in Venezuela aren't new. The leadership in Venezuela isn't new either. I'm just wondering, what is this sudden interest of the United States in Venezuela? What's their interest?
In my hypothesis, I think they have four scenarios that interest the United States. The first one, we have to say there are humanitarian crisis, political crisis, and economical crisis. There are people dying in Venezuela. When Maduro blocked the border between Venezuela and Colombia, they are killing people because the Venezuelan people don't receive medicine, they don't receive food to eat. I think this is one of the questions that the U.S. administration is focused. The second one is more in the oil sector, can be Citgo is one of the most relevant assets that have PDVSA, is the national oil company, and is based in United States. And 2 years ago, Venezuela need money to pay his debt, and they say, I give to Russia 15% of the company in collateral, and if I am in default, you take and half of the company. So this is one problem for the security of United States because it will be the first time that a Russian company will take the hands of three biggest refineries in the Gulf of Mexico. The first one can be for political propaganda from Mr. Trump to say, when I was debating with Clinton say in the election, said they will not make the pipeline between Canada and the United States. The name is XL pipeline. And now Trump, several months ago, said he will do it. Now with the price that the shortage in the heavy crude oil, that because Venezuela sell to United States heavy oil crude, the price are so high that interesting that to make a pipeline for heavy oil crude from Canada and United States. So now they have also this input to say, now we have an argument to say we need to do this pipeline. And the fourth one can be also the cartel of drug that is handled by some military in the government, the Cartel del Sol, then send drugs to Mexico and then can be resold in the United States. So this is the first point for the moment that interests the administration of Trump.
Okay, let me put that question to Professor Buxton, Professor Julia Buxton, who joins us from Leeds. I mean, what we're just hearing there, I mean, a couple of issues there that the United States may be particularly interested in, some human rights concerns, and also this issue of oil. Were it not for oil, would the United States be remotely interested in what was happening in Venezuela, do you think?
Well, I think they would be interested in what was happening in Venezuela. I think what we're seeing under the Trump administration is something of a pushback against the presence of the left. So foreign powers such as Russia and China, who are in Venezuela because of Cuba, but I think there is a real sense in the United States that it's trying to reclaim the so-called backyard and really kind of reassert its authority in South America. So with or without the oil, I still think we would probably be seeing some form of US action to push back against the so-called communist threat that's in Latin America.
Okay, let me turn now to Geneva, Professor De Zayas. I mean, what's your interpretation of the road that the United States seems to be going down? I mean, sanctions have been in place for a long time against Venezuela, but the United States really seems to be stepping things up at the moment. Where do you see things heading? I'm not sure if you can hear me, Professor Zayas. Let me put that question to you again. Sanctions are nothing new. The US is stepping things up. Where do you see things heading from here? Okay, we seem to have a bit of an audio issue there with Geneva. Let's cross to Washington. Mike Gonzales from the Heritage Foundation is standing by patiently. Last but not least, we come to you.
You there?
Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Could you just start by telling us what you think are the likely next steps, given that the United States really seems to be stepping things up?
When Maduro assumed power on January 10th, after very fraudulent elections, nobody in the world believed that the elections he held last year were anything but a sham. So when he assumes power, you were asking why this crisis has been precipitated. When he assumes power on January 10th, the Venezuelan constitution says that in the case of a vacancy, which occurs when Maduro assumes power, the person who takes power is the head of the National Assembly. In this case, was Juan Guaido. So that is what has happened. I don't agree that oil has had anything to do with this. I think that the Lima Group. I think that if I'm hearing a little bit of back talk here. The election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and of Ivan Duque in Colombia, both of which happened last year, are kind of catalysts themselves. They obviously Bolsonaro is a very different person than Dilma Rousseff or Lula da Silva, and Duque is very different from Santos. So I think this is one of the reasons why we've had the events of the last month.
So what you're basically saying is that the climate in the whole region has taken a fairly decisive shift in the last couple of months, really.
Completely. Let's not forget that Brazil and Colombia are Venezuela's biggest neighbors. In the case of Colombia, it's in some ways a very similar country. So when power changes hands in both these countries, they're both members of the Lima Group, and then Maduro assumes power fraudulently, and you have a figure like Guaido, I think all the planets fall into place.
Let me just pick up on a point you just made there and put it to Professor Buxton. I mean, we just heard there Mike Gonzales saying that Maduro has taken power fraudulently. I just wonder whether you agree with that statement.
I've always felt that the Venezuelan election system had improved, certainly in the 2000s. I think the issue is maybe less on the technicalities of the election process that was held in May of 2018. Certainly there was a number of candidates who were disqualified, so that obviously raises questions about the freeness and the fairness of that election process. But I think the challenge really in defending any legitimacy on the part of Maduro is that we have seen Maduro constantly trying to avoid election processes and has used all kinds of constitutional manipulations, including cancelling through the National Election Council the recall referendum. And so the problem really has been an accumulation, I think we should say, of electoral manipulation in the country, which has brought us to the situation that we are in today.
Let's try going back to Geneva and speaking to Professor De Zayas. I'm sorry, we had a bit of an audio issue earlier, but I mean, what's your assessment? I mean, is Nicolas Maduro a legitimate leader or not?
As you know, I visited Venezuela in November, December 2017. I had opportunity of speaking with members of the opposition, of the National Assembly, of the Chamber of Commerce, the cámaras, of professors, etc. I also spent quite a bit of time at the Electoral Commission. I studied the documentation of the Electoral Commission, also the history of 26 elections that have taken place in Venezuela since 1999, since the election of Hugo Chavez. Now, as far as the elections in May 2018, this is something that the government discussed and negotiated with the opposition. Now, the idea was the opposition wanted to accelerate the elections, and the government agreed with that demand. And that was laid down in an agreement which José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, the former foreign minister of Spain, had hosted 2 years, and then at the last moment, Julio Borges refused to sign it. In any event, I do consider, according to the Venezuelan constitution, I consider Maduro to be the legitimate president. I know Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution, and I do not believe that Guaidó can rely on Article 233 for his claim. As a matter of fact, Guaidó has actually zero legitimacy in my eyes and in the eyes of a lot of experts. On the other hand, there is such a media pressure also on me as an independent expert to go along with what they want me to say. And I am concerned about what I would call the ocean of disinformation in which we are swimming. Now, my report to the Human Rights Council presented last September had a number of recommendations. The government actually has implemented quite a few of those recommendations. With regard to humanitarian aid, for instance, Maduro has asked the United Nations for humanitarian assistance, for technical assistance, for the fastest relief from the sanctions, from the economic war, from the financial blockade. As you know, most bank accounts of Venezuela have been closed. The Bank of England is retaining $31 million worth of gold, or rather 31 tons, which are $1.2 billion. The United States has also sequestered and frozen the assets of the Venezuelan government. So the Venezuelan government has had a very rough time in buying and any medicines and any food abroad. However, they did receive 10 days ago 933 tons of medicines and food from China and India and Cuba and Turkey. And that has been distributed with the help of the United Nations and UNDP. They also received 300 tons of medicines and medical supplies and dialysis supplies from Russia. They have asked, and they're going to receive now, considerable aid from the European Union.
Okay, so let me put this to you, Professor. Why are they not letting the US aid in that's sitting on the border between Venezuela and Brazil?
That is quite obvious, because look, you cannot be the tormentor. You cannot be the cause of the crisis and then play yourself as a good Samaritan. You cannot just asphyxiate the economy of a country, as the United States did with Salvador Allende. And the thing is, when it didn't work, 3 years of economic war against Salvador Allende did not topple him. It was necessary to have the muscle of General Pinochet and have Salvador Allende murdered. So here you have a situation in which Guaido is lending itself to the interest of the United States, and there have been simply too many right-wing coups in Latin America. There was the coup in Grenada, there was the coup in Panama, there was the coup in Honduras.
Okay.
I mean, it's enough.
All right, let's let some other people have a say. Let's go back to Washington. Mike Gonzales, let me put that to you. Just picking up on what Professor De Zayas was saying there. The United States is the tormentor playing the Good Samaritan. How do you answer to that?
My goodness, to sit in Geneva in a cushy job and a day after President Maduro, strongman Maduro, has burned 3 trucks full of humanitarian aid in the middle of a humanitarian crisis. It's in an utter display of sadism. And they're shooting on unarmed demonstrators. And no country, no democracy in the world recognizes Maduro. The only regimes in the world that recognize Maduro are all the thuggish regimes in the world, such as Russia, Iran, Cuba, which is the colonial power of Venezuela. To speak about the U.S. as being the heavy here, Cuba has 25,000 agents in Venezuela. The head of the OAS, Luis Almagro, has called it an army of occupation. They are the ones torturing the Venezuelan people. To talk about Allende, that was 50 years ago. There's 25,000 Cuban agents in Caracas today.
Let me put that back to you. How do you respond to that, Professor De Zayas?
Well, you know the book of Stephen Kinzer, Overthrow, which documents 100 years of United States imperialism. There's a new book, Killing Hope, by William Bloom. Now, I think it's important that we put things in historical perspective. The United States already connived at the coup d'etat conducted on the 11th of April 2002 against Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez was supposed to be murdered, but he was liberated by the Venezuelan military. Now, what does Pedro Carmona do the moment he takes over? He sells out. I mean, he wants to privatize everything. Okay. Of course, it's the bonanza for U.S. business, and John Bolton himself has admitted it.
I'm going to have to ask all of you,
could
you park that thought? I'm afraid we have to take a short break. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back with part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of the France 24 debate. Today we've got our eye trained to Venezuela, where there was a violent standoff on the Colombian and Brazilian borders this weekend. This as President Nicolas Maduro refused to let in aid into his country, calling it a smokescreen for US military intervention. Well, around 50 world powers recognize Juan Guaido as being the country's legitimate leader. Amongst those countries, the United States. And this Monday, those countries have been gathering in the Colombian capital to discuss next steps. We can listen in to what Juan Guaido had to say in Bogota a little earlier on today.
To be indulgent with this group's usurpation of power would be a threat to democracy throughout the Americas. It's not a dilemma between democracy and dictatorship. It is democracy that must prevail. They've tried to present it as a dilemma between peace and war. There is no dilemma. Peace must prevail. The protection of citizens must prevail.
Juan Guaido speaking there in Bogota a short while ago at the Lima Group summit. Well, our Simone Bruno is there following that summit and joins us now. Simone, just tell us what has been discussed there in Bogota. What's been said?
Right. First, the presidents and all the people participating to the Lima Group met early in the morning, and then they gave some declaration to the press. Right now, Vice President Mike Pence left, and the group is still working and still deciding on a final declaration that will be made public in the next few hours. So what has been told so far is that they want to keep on going with the sanctions, and they want to keep on going, trying to get other humanitarian aid inside Venezuela. Honestly, this is still the same strategy they have been using so far, and the past weekend has been proved a bit of a failure because President Maduro actually is still in power. The number of militaries that have been invited to join Colombia, to leave the Venezuelan army and to come to Colombia, of course, has been important, but it's not so important to worry Maduro. And the situation is that they really don't know exactly what to do next. Venezuelan opposition, Juan Guaido, they have been asking for a military intervention pretty openly lately. But it seems like this group, the Lima Group, is a group that is not really intended to start a conflict in this region. After all, this group has been created to find a pacific solution to the crisis in Venezuela.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that update from Bogota. Our correspondent Simone Bruno there with the latest on that Lima summit. Let's come back to my guest here in the studio, Luis Colasante, who's a Venezuelan financial strategist. As we've been saying, sanctions have been in place for quite some time, targeting various sectors of the Venezuelan economy. Just tell us, from your point of view, just how bad have things got? Because you know the country, you're from there, and you're a financial strategist. Just how much of an effect have they had on the country?
We need to put the thing right in his place. The sanction from the oil company started in January of this year. Before that, there was sanction from physical person. It means the person who was in the first circle of the Maduro administration. So it was not really an impact in the sanction in the economy of Venezuela. It was only for persons who have account in the United States, who have account in Andorra, in Geneva, etc. But no for the country. For the moment, the situation is very badly. We have a 95% of shortage of medicine. Hospital, can find medicine. Equipment, they don't work. The criminality is one of the highest in America Latin. The inflation at the beginning of the year, it was higher than 1 million person in inflation, and we expect at the end of the year, of 2019, an inflation of 10 million of persons. It means multiplied by 10. We have, for example, if we speak about salary or wage, minimum wage, one person who have one salary at home can only buy 2% of the basic food basket. It means if you want to feed your family, you need at least 15 minimum salary. We have shortage of electricity, we have shortage of water, we have shortage of gasoline, and we have the biggest reserve in the world of oil.
Okay, so very difficult to reconcile the fact that the country is so oil rich, and yet the people of Venezuela are living in conditions that 20 years ago, they would never have imagined, because this was, after all, a very rich country, a very prosperous country. Let's turn back to our panel. I'd like to turn to Professor Buxton, who's been keeping very quiet there in Leeds. Time for us to come back to you. Just listening to what our financial consultant said here in the studio, he's from Venezuela. The situation there for Venezuelan people is absolutely dire. And yet we're hearing from Nicolas Maduro that there's no such problem, that the situation is absolutely fine. He says it's all an invented crisis. I mean, how can he say that when we're hearing such a different narrative from people who simply can't find food to eat and medicine to treat those who need it?
Well, for sure, this is a really quite catastrophic situation for a number of Venezuelans. The challenge that we have is that this situation has been building for a long time. This has been a question of years, not just months or days. Venezuela has had problems with its electricity, with its water, with its economic policy, certainly since Maduro is in power, but also towards the latter stages of the Hugo Chavez government. Maduro will inevitably be denying the scale of this crisis, and there is a lot of efforts at the moment to get supplies in, as one of your guests was highlighting before. There is a lot of information coming out now and images coming out now about food in supermarkets and access to medicine. But the challenge really is that we are not necessarily getting the food and medicine to the people who need it the most, and that's probably the biggest problem we have right now.
Let's go back to Geneva. Professor De Zayas, I mean, how can you say that President Maduro is the legitimate leader of a country when he's in denial about the gravity of the financial situation in his country? Because as we've been hearing, and as we hear constantly from people on the ground and the millions of people who've fled Venezuela in recent years, the situation is absolutely catastrophic. And yet here we have a man who says, what problem? Everything's fine.
No, he doesn't say that. This is a caricature. He doesn't say that at all. Neither does Arriaza, neither do the ministers with whom I spoke. They all are very much aware of the consequences, not only of the latest sanctions, the consequences of an economic war that started in 1999, consequences of an economic war and a financial blockade. If you cannot buy, if you want to make a transfer, and you cannot make that transfer because the banks are afraid of penalties to the U.S. Treasury, you are asphyxiating the country. And the guilt here, and I'm saying it is a crime against humanity that the United States is committing on the people of Venezuela. Maternal mortality, infant mortality, malnutrition is all the direct result of the economic war and of the financial blockade. Let me recall Article 19, Chapter 4 of the OAS Charter, which says no state or group of states has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatever in the internal or external affairs of any other state. The foregoing principle prohibits not only armed force, but also any other form of interference or attempted threat against the personality of the state or against its political, economic, and cultural elements. Now, these sanctions are all in violation of Article 19. They're all in violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, of Article 1 of the UN Charter, which guarantees the sovereign equality of states, of customary international law that guarantees freedom of commerce. The country has suffered an economic war just like Chile suffered it, and just like Nicaragua suffered. Here is a professor of economics in Venezuela, whom I was able to interview. I interviewed also others who wrote this book, La mano visible del mercado, the visible hand of the market, that documents, I'm saying documents, how the financial blockade has ruined the Venezuelan economy, how the inflation is induced, the impact of dollar today in Miami, the manipulations, the speculation with the currency, the smuggling of Venezuelan subsidized foods into Colombia, into Brazil, into the Aruba and Curacao. It is shocking what is being done. And it is shocking that the media does not report on it. I had to do, as independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, an enormous amount of research to find out what were the causes of the crisis.
Okay.
And I went to Venezuela thinking the causes of the crisis is just that there are a bunch of ideologues and too few technocrats. That's part of the cause, but not the only cause.
Okay.
Really,
let's ask our financial strategist here in the studio. Mr. Colasante, do you agree with what what's saying there, the professor?
No, at all. It's a shame that the people in Geneva think in this way. I don't think this is the totally people who live there that think, as you, Mr. Alfred. One of the points is there are no war in economical war. I don't see what is the difference between U.S. Back in Venezuela or the difference that China, Cuba, Turkey, and Cuba back in Venezuela. We give to Cuba 100,000 barrels of oil for free. We give China with we don't know what type of pricing, but we calculate around $10 per barrel, around 500,000 barrels by day. So the only income that we have is the income that we sell our oil to U.S. that pay cash. At least, and the sanction start in January of this year, and we have 3 months that the company continued to buy Venezuelan petroleum. It's been Chevron actually bought in the month of February at least 100,000 barrels of oil. So I don't know where is the war in the economic war since. From U.S. to Venezuela, they don't exist. There are only some people that have sanctions, that have account in United States, and didn't have the possibility to show where they can his revenue. They have millions of dollars, and didn't have. There was a military, there was the security of Chavez, security for Maduro, and they didn't have the income to have Villa at $5-10 million. And this is why the first cycle of Chavez and Maduro was sanctioned, but it was a personal sanction. It's not from for a country's point of view.
Okay, let's turn our eye back to the diplomatic situation and the conference that's taking place in Bogota, this Lima Group. I'd like to go back to Washington and ask Mike Gonzales. We've been hearing from the Trump administration that the Maduro administration's days are numbered. And I'm just wondering, what you think the US might do next. Is there an appetite for a confrontation, a military confrontation there in the United States?
Sure. Let me address 2 points that were raised by the previous professor. I hope he doesn't teach finance or economics, because as the world knows, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. And the reason you have 1,000,000% inflation in Venezuela today is because of the ineptitude of the Venezuelan monetary authorities as to the idea that Venezuela is in a blockade and cannot trade with the rest of the world. Of course, millions of tons of drugs are imported from Colombia because the Maduro regime is a narco regime, and they sell these drugs all over the world and enriching themselves. So there are no problems with imports or exports out of Venezuela. Now, as to the meetings in Colombia today, look, sanctions are ongoing. Just today, Monday, February the 25th, new additional sanctions were announced by the Treasury Department. 4 governors have had their assets blocked in the United States, quite considerable assets, because as I said, these people are narco traffickers, and they all whisk away their money in the United States. So their money, considerable amount of money that these 4 governors have in the United States banks, have been blocked, have been frozen. This has just been announced today. I expect to see more of the same. Another diplomatic approach. I expect that hard talks will be had with members of the military brass, who are the only people who are supporting Maduro. We can see the rank and file soldier is not supporting Maduro. Dozens left and aligned themselves with the rightful government of Juan Guaido. But what I think is happening, I don't have any special information, is that conversations are being had with generals, and they're saying to them, look, you can have a future. All that money you've stolen, you can keep it. or you can just face prison for the rest of your life. You make a choice. You align yourself with the correct government, or you align yourself with this government that is burning truckloads of humanitarian aid in the middle of a humanitarian crisis caused by the socialism they have practiced for 20 years. Socialism has failed in East Germany, failed in North Korea. Of course, it's going to fail in Venezuela, the country with the deepest reserves of oil in the world.
Okay, let's go back to Professor Buxton. Professor Buxton, I mean, the Lima Group has been discussing a whole series of options today, where we might head to from here. They seem to be aligned on a number of issues, but on this issue of military intervention, there seems to be a split. Washington seems to be slightly more bellicose, shall we say, than some of the other countries in the Lima Group. Do you see the group as being a divided one?
Not at the moment. I think that the Lima Group represents probably the most coherent of the organizations which are really trying to push forward regime change in Latin America. The Lima Group, as your listeners might not be aware, came out of the Organization of American States, which itself could not decide on the way ahead on Venezuela because there was deep divisions over issues of sovereignty and there was profound concern over US possible intervention in the country. So I think the real challenge that we have at the moment is really, it's a diplomatic one. And the Lima Group is simply not being able to mediate pressure from the United States for a more bellicose solution, a more bellicose language that we're seeing coming out. We saw extraordinary tweets over the weekend from Marco Rubio of images of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya after the fall of his government. It was really quite shocking to see those kinds of images being tweeted by a US senator. We had the statement by Pompeo over the weekend that there was no negotiations to have, only when Maduro was leaving. This kind of very bullish narrative really isn't going to keep the European Union countries behind the United States, and it's certainly not going to play well with Latin America, which, as has been highlighted, has had a very long and unfortunate history of various forms of US intervention. And any step by the US, I think, to try and push a military solution will see any coalition fragment around, certainly around the Lima Group.
Yeah, and the European Union said today that they are absolutely opposed to military intervention there in Venezuela. So that's another voice that's been added to the discussion. I just want to talk about the role of other international powers. It's not just the United States, of course, that decides what the future of Venezuela will be. It's not just the Lima Group. Venezuela has got some important backers. Nicolas Maduro is supported by Russia and China. And of course, Venezuela is important to them because Beijing has lent Venezuela some $50 billion through oil for loan agreements. And, you know, the Chinese do not want to find themselves backing the wrong government, do they? I mean, let me ask you, Luis, do you believe that China and Russia will stand by President Maduro and his regime forevermore? Or do you think that they could be persuaded to offer their support to another government, given the size of their investment in the country?
The two countries have interest in Venezuela, but they have different type of policy. China, they say, I take position for the moment for Maduro, but I don't put my hands in the fire. Russia, there is more in the plane to say, well, yes, we are this is United States who are playing the chess in Latin America. So there are really two different type of policy, but two countries have interest in Venezuela. China have interested in the mining sector, gold, esmeralda, cobalto, uranium, and Russia have interest in oil sector. So they have two different type of policy. I don't know what will be the future. I am no spoken for this type of country, but I think the alignment for the country as Cuba, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, we will continue to play to say this is the fault of the United States.
Let's cross back to Geneva and speak to Professor De Zayas. Let me ask you, I mean, we see the Lima Group exists. There is this dialogue taking place between these countries that basically want to bring about a change of leadership in Venezuela. Are you seeing any corresponding actions on the part of Nicolas Maduro's allies, of which we've discussed the number, Turkey, China and Russia being perhaps the most important? Are they doing anything?
Let's leave it in Latin America. Mexico and Uruguay have hosted a meeting in Montevideo, attended, by the way, by the several countries of the European Union, with the view of having a mediation, which the Secretary General of the United Nations and Michelle Bachelet have also proposed. Now, Switzerland, being a neutral country, and I am a Swiss citizen, is also prepared to participate in a mediation. But we have here the Lima Group actually violating Articles 3 and 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 of their own OAS charter. This is a breakdown in international order when brazenly countries that supposedly support democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are willing to support a pretender. Now, as I said, Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution does not allow Guaido to autoproclaim himself president. So here we have an unconstitutional pretender who is being supported by the Lima Group. That in itself is a frontal attack on international law, is an attack on General Assembly Resolution 2625, on General Assembly Resolution 3314, and it's like they've all joined the club for the looting that is going to follow. And you remember what happened after the right-wing putsch in Chile, 17 years of a cruel dictatorship under General Pinochet. I don't think anyone wishes that upon the Venezuelan people. But what concerns me, and that is what my other colleagues in this discussion don't seem to perceive, is that at least 6.5 million Venezuelans are committed Chavistas. And even if they murder Maduro, these people are not going to disappear. They're not going to roll over. So you're really playing with fire. You're playing with a possibility of a very nasty civil war. So the only solution is that proposed by Mexico and Uruguay to have a negotiation. But there was already a negotiation 2016, 2017, 2018. They reached a reasonable agreement ready for signature on the 6th of February of 2018. The phone rings, Julio Borges picks it up. He's told no firme, and he doesn't sign. So he took everybody for a ride for 2 years. So is there any good faith? These Lima Group people only want to topple the government of Maduro.
Okay, let me pick up on a point you just made there. Okay, let's pick up on a point you made there. These people who remain dyed-in-the-wool supporters of, let's say, the ideals of Hugo Chavez. Mike Gonzales, what is your understanding as to what keeps a dedicated Chavista, or in this case, a dedicated supporter of President Maduro, loyal? What's keeping them loyal? And what's keeping the military supportive of President Nicolas Maduro, in your opinion?
The only, in my opinion, the only dedicated Chavistas you have sit in Havana. In the poor neighborhoods of Venezuela, it has become clear that people are no longer supporting what Maduro has been doing since 2014. The only reason why he's still in power is because he thinks, first of all, he's surrounded by Cuban agents, and Cuban agents are the ones that are conducting the torture sessions. He has convinced a handful, perhaps 2 handfuls of generals to stay with them, but I don't. He obviously, if you've seen the crowds that turned out for Juan Guaido, there were massive crowds. He has lost the street. This is only, and he's toppled himself. From any perspective of human decency, he's going to have to go. To repeat, he burned 3 truckloads of humanitarian aid in the middle of a humanitarian crisis. This will not be forgotten.
Okay. All right. Well, you've had the last word in this edition of the France 24 debate because we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Mike Gonzales, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you to my guest here in the studio, Luis Colasante, a Venezuelan financial strategist. Thank you very much indeed to Professor Alfred De Zayas in Geneva, Professor of Law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Julia Buxton at the Central European University in Budapest. Thank you to all of you very much indeed for taking part in our France 24 debate, and thanks to you for watching. See you again soon here on France 24.